And there we go, my friends. We have hit the end. So, I think for this one, I'm not going to drag it out too much. I don't think there was kind of enough there to really make, like, you know, I remember spending 90 minutes on Final Fantasy 16. We won't be doing that. I will just kind of overview first. This is the Final Fantasy that I enjoyed the least of all the ones that I've played so far. I came in with low expectations. As I said right from the beginning, the general narrative across all of the conversations I'd had, all the polls I've seen over the years, everything that I know from the community, told me that Final Fantasy 2 was one of, if not the kind of quote-unquote worst ones in the series. And so I came into this game knowing that. I was under no false illusions, and still, I can't really say that it like exceeded my expectations. It's better than I thought. It's even a little bit worse than I thought, honestly. Like I was kind of hoping to say that, yeah, I get it has a lot of hate, but I can kind of still see a lot of good in this game. Unfortunately, I can't. And so for me, it probably goes down as not only the Final Fantasy that I enjoyed the least, but the first Final Fantasy experience I would say I didn't enjoy overall. Because up until this point, whenever I've said, like, when people ask me which is, like, your least favorite, like, the worst Final Fantasy, if I'm talking about games in that realm, I always make sure I share the caveat that I still enjoyed the game overall. It wasn't like I didn't enjoy it, but it was the one I enjoyed the least of the ones I played up until this point. This one, I think, for me, falls below that sort of enjoy threshold. I think if I said I enjoyed this experience, like, overall, I think I'd be lying. And I don't want to kind of sugarcoat it too much here. Now, were there times I did enjoy it? For sure. Were there aspects I enjoyed? Definitely. But I think putting it all together as like an overall thing, I think I'd be hard pressed to say I enjoyed this game overall. So let's talk about... It's tough because obviously it's very difficult to talk about this game without like the context and all of that kind of stuff. And I think this is one of the first games where for me that only goes so far. The further back we go, I'm trying to give games like the benefit of the doubt. I'm like, look, if we look at, you know, how early it was in the series and the general like ability of the company at the time, how many games had even been released up until that point, like the general archive of gaming that had been available up until that point. When you go this far back, a lot of these like legendary franchises and stuff, they're only just starting to find their feet and they're trying to figure things out. So expecting these to be like the absolute kind of gold standard that a lot of companies hit kind of later on in their stride is just like, you know, any of us trying to do anything, we tend to, over time, we get better and we hit our prime, then we spend some time in our prime and then usually things get worse. Like that's probably the average experience for, you know, most of this kind of stuff. And for me, at least so far, it does seem like Final Fantasy has had that kind of life cycle where it had a bit of a shaky start. Like, I don't think it started off with absolute bangers of games. Like, you know, I'm not expecting Final Fantasy 1 to be like, oh, what a great game. I'm expecting it's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. And like a good first ever intro into the franchise and a birthplace for it. But kind of, for me, moving forward, I can see a trajectory. Like 2, for me, was a game I didn't enjoy. 3 was above that threshold of I did enjoy it, but it wasn't exactly like, oh, what a great game. But it was pretty good. Then 4, I was like, okay, this is a good game. Like, this is a legit good game. 5, again, legit good game. 6, masterpiece. Love 6. Then we have, like, basically the whole 6 to 10 kind of phase anyway. And then, depending on who you speak to, 12 you can also include in that prime phase. I would say it's on, like, the very tail end of the prime, when things started to sort of get wobbly and start to drop a little bit. But I would still kind of consider it the prime. But the absolute prime, I would say, is 6 to 10. And then from 12 onwards, obviously, things get more and more wobbly. And I think you'd be hard-pressed for anyone to say that, like, 13 to 16 is the golden era or the prime of Final Fantasy. I don't think it is. So when you look at that whole, like, life cycle thing, 2 is kind of where you expect it to be. They're still figuring things out. They definitely don't have everything locked down. There's things that you saw in this game that you basically never saw again in the franchise, like the growth system that they used for this one basically wasn't really used like that again for the rest of the franchise, and with good reason. You can see that. I think the aspects of it, like, interestingly, I think in terms of like the story and the presentation of it, like the cast members we had and the general presentation of the story, I thought was fine because that's one area where I definitely wasn't expecting too much. Like I'm not expecting like this big, deep kind of lore-filled story, this amazing adventure, and like, you know, this incredible set of cast members. And like 3, once we went back as far as 3, I was like, okay, I can kind of see what's going on here, and it's going to get more and more basic as we go back, and that's fine because it has to start from somewhere. But 2, actually, I kind of liked it more than 3 on that front, because we had a more defined set of cast members and that kind of thing. It wasn't as kind of the way 3 did it, I just wasn't as big a fan of. So I think 2, overall I probably still like it a bit better just for that specific aspect. And so that's not an area where I was particularly disappointed. It was fine. But for me, like the gameplay experience, I think just held it down too much. Some of like the design ideas and philosophies here, I just don't think they hit. And some aspects of those continue throughout the franchise, but I think some of them definitely didn't. So obviously the first one would be the growth system. It's one where I definitely understand the idea here, like the fact that there's not specific experience points and that kind of thing, and that you grow based on what you actually do and what happens to you in the battle. There is definitely like some magic to that. Like there's something clever about designing a system that way. But the way that they've done it in this game, as you've seen, I just don't think it was the right implementation. And moving forward, I just don't think they could find the right way to do it, because we basically never saw it in that way again. Like where, let's say, depending on the damage you take in battle, that's how much your HP will go up and that kind of thing. And it was tough because I think I probably noticed it the most in terms of magic and the moves. Like in terms of HP and in terms of your strength, I think it actually worked pretty well. Like I would have been okay with future Final Fantasies having a system where, let's say, depending on the damage you take, you get some inherent HP growth anyway, but then depending on how much damage you take, you also can grow more if you take more damage. And then I probably would have found what I would consider a clever way to bypass people exploiting that by, say, you know, damage you inflict to yourself doesn't count, for example, and that kind of thing. So that aspect of it was fine, but I think for me, the magic and the growth system that they used for magic was quite a letdown. Obviously, in order to have a fully fledged experience with the game in terms of trying to use all of the tools they give you, and by that I mean, you know, buffs, debuffs, the different elementals that you can use, the more powerful magic, the healing spells, all of that kind of stuff. There's a lot of moves you have to use in battle to do that. And if they're at low levels, they're just not that useful, especially elemental magic, that it was so useless. Anything up to like level 5 or 6, unless the enemy was specifically weak to that, and especially relative to attack power, like physical attacks, magic was so weak that the system that they have in this game for growth and for magic, it felt like a bit of a waste of time to even bother trying to develop magic. Like either you literally pick one spell from the very start and you stick to it, and you only work on fire. Like one person just does fire, one person does blizzard, one person does thunder, and well, on a blind run, it's much more difficult to know those things and to manage it. Then maybe by the time you get to the end, like fire's at like level 12 or something, and it's more effective. But then, of course, you have, well, which status ailments do you teach? Do you teach blind? Do you teach this? Do you teach that? And then there's obviously, you know, healing spells. Then there's people coming in and out of the party. So you invest in some particular buffs or some particular spells. Then that party member disappears and a new person comes in with, oftentimes with no abilities of their own. So you have to give them new stuff, then you start from scratch and you have to build that up. And for example, say like Basuna at level 6, it cures confusion. But if you've not been encountering that many kind of times where you need to use a Basuna, then you have to use it for no reason to get it up to level 6. Because I don't think there was enough situations where Basuna was actually needed in battle for me to ever get to a level 6. So what would be the point? And so you have to kind of find these weird ways to kind of just use moves for no reason and farm stuff. And it just didn't work. I just don't think it was a very good system. Like I said, I think specifically for HP, and I think for weapon proficiency and attack power and stuff, I think it worked pretty well. But as an overall package, I just didn't like the way that they implemented that stuff. So I think that was one of the things I definitely did not like about the game. One thing I generally don't like about the old school Final Fantasies anyway is, of course, the encounter rates and the way that things work with that whole thing. There's games that have like good enough aspects of it that you can kind of mitigate that. Like Final Fantasy V, for example, the gameplay for that game I thought was really, really nice. And so I felt a lot less frustration about the encounter rates of Final Fantasy V. For this game, they paired the general issue, for me at least, of high encounter rates with dungeon design that was often like very deliberately designed to just keep you in there, keep you fighting battles, trap you, send you along the wrong path, all of that kind of stuff. Like obviously we literally had trap rooms. The trap room idea I liked in general, but the ratio for me was off. Like I would have liked maybe 10% of rooms to be trap rooms, and then there's like a guaranteed mini boss encounter in there or something, maybe 5%. Like throwing it in now and then as like something you don't expect was cool, but you'd go into a dungeon and like 80 to 90% of rooms would be trap rooms. And so that for me was just no fun. It wasn't good design personally. And then again, when you couple that with the fact there's already a ton of high encounters, like the rate is so high, it's just not a good mix. So the dungeon design did not like. They don't give you any pit stops in there. There's no way to save. There's no way to replenish HP or MP. Some might call that challenging. As you guys saw, I didn't exactly die all the time. I didn't struggle with this game. I was basically toying with the final boss. I didn't have that hard a time. So I don't think it was like, oh yes, this was the challenge of playing back in the day. It's just like, no, it's just annoying. And so I think giving players some kind of pit stop to recover HP or MP, or like a teleport point out, and then maybe you can come back into the same place, or just offering up a chance to save, I don't think it would have made the experience any worse if they did that. I think it's just an improvement that was necessary. And I'll come to the pixel remaster aspect of it at the end of this little kind of review thing. But that aspect of it I didn't like about the dungeons too. And then the final thing I would say about the dungeons and the general gameplay was that the boss battles were trash in this game. There was not enough of them, and when they did happen, they were almost always a letdown. So the boss battles were just pants in this game. Very curious to see where they come from with Final Fantasy 1, I think, with that. I do wonder if the boss battles of Final Fantasy 1 are basically the same as this one, or if they're even worse, because it's obviously literally the first entry, maybe even less variety, even less opportunity, we'll see. But for Final Fantasy 2, just like, so, like, when you have that many encounters and that long a dungeon, you kind of want a nice satisfying boss battle at the end to kind of make it a bit more exciting and worth it. And quite often that just didn't happen. You had things that seemed like boss battles, and then it turned into basically a glorified random encounter. And so for me, anyone that follows my content knows I do enjoy the boss battles, and having like these intense moments in these games for me is part of what makes the Final Fantasy gameplay experience special. And I don't think any game has been as bad as Final Fantasy 2 on the boss battle front. So that was another pretty glaring issue for me. So, because literally, you know, exploration and the dungeons, the boss battles, and the gameplay / mechanics, the growth systems and stuff, that makes up such a core aspect of the game that, for me at least, it's just not, like, there's no way I can view this overall experience as positive when such a large chunk of the game, for me, was relatively uninteresting and just generally frustrating and not that fun. I remember areas like the tropical island where just like it was just so repetitive, so many different pathways to go through. The enemies, because they're such old games, they just don't have the bestiary that you are used to from the newer games. And so again, it just doesn't serve you well when you have a very high encounter rate, but you don't have the bestiary to cover that. So you literally have maybe 6 different enemies in a dungeon, or 8 different enemies in a dungeon, but you have to fight 100 times. Especially if you want to try and get the chest, or you keep falling into trap rooms and all of that kind of stuff. And those 6 enemies are gonna get boring very fast. So when you do enter a new place, you get new enemies, you start seeing some different moves. You start wondering, how much damage can this version of this enemy do? Like, the early part of dungeons were fun. Like, the first maybe half an hour of most dungeons, I generally had a good time. But they just drag on so long that by the time I get to the end of it, I've already forgotten the good time I had at the start. And so that's why, again, overall, I end up not enjoying them, even though I was quite excited for, like, different phases of it. And so, yeah, it just didn't have enough to redeem itself, I think, on that front. So when you have, like, you know, a story, a cast, dialogue moments and stuff that were generally okay, they were fine, they were serviceable, but the rest of all of this stuff that I've talked about is still, it just drags it below that sort of treading water level to be like not overall a great game for me. Now, I want to say a special word here. This feels a bit like if a team does really badly, they lose badly, but there's that one player who just gave it everything. You know, let's say for the sake of argument, let's just use football/soccer here as an example. Let's say you lose like 6-2, and then you have this like one player who just fought like a lion the entire game, just did everything that they could do, and they scored the 2 goals, but the team lost, and the team in general was crap. But this one guy was the one that kind of held everything together, and even people from the outside that didn't like what they saw, they could pick out that guy and say, yes, like this guy is talented, this guy you know, doesn't deserve the criticism that the rest of the team should get. And that guy in this game, for me at least, it's Nobuo Uematsu, because what he achieved with this game's soundtrack, it's the high standard that we're used to from him anyway. He's an absolute god. I mean, but playing a game like this, for me, is like, if you ask me what is the single aspect of this game that you think is high quality, that's like in like the, you know, A/A+ category, I would have to say it's the soundtrack. The soundtrack of this game was great. It was really, really good. There was some nice boss battle music in there. The normal battle theme didn't get old for me, and in general, like, it was just high quality. It's that same consistent, legendary Uematsu quality that we know and love throughout the series. And so even if like the quality of the games goes up and down, the one constant almost every single time is Uematsu's genius. And that's one situation where for him I kind of feel bad not liking the game, because he just did so well, he just went so hard, and he felt like the one guy in the team that kind of still did his job to the level that we know he can. And so yeah, Uematsu gets a special mention, especially for this game, because so often his music accompanies really good / great games anyway, that he's just another reason why the game is great. This one, he is great in spite of the game, for me at least, being nowhere near great, and so I just want to give him some extra credit for that one. And so yeah, I think that's pretty much all I'll say for this one. In general, did not love this game at all. It fell below that enjoyable threshold, but the only thing I will say is, if you are going to play these games, I still strongly recommend, for this game especially, you got to go the pixel remaster route. Unless you were literally from that era, you were gaming in the 80s, and you have some familiarity with how it used to be back then, like with this game and that kind of thing, and you're looking to replay it again potentially, then maybe, yeah, you'll still go back to the OG experience. But for me, the pixel remaster, I'm sure even like with Uematsu's soundtrack, they've done a really good job of remastering and like potentially rearranging some of Uematsu's work. So even the soundtrack, you know, I think it gets a little boost from the pixel remasters. But some of the quality of life stuff, like the maps, imagine all of those dungeons without maps. It's just like, it would be even more torturous. The fact that you can quick save, little things like that. I don't have an extensive list of changes, but for me at least, those two things alone, basically the pixel remaster gives it like an extra +1 out of 10. I would say maybe 1 to 1.5 out of 10 for like how much more bearable it makes the experience. So I think maybe like without, in its like rawest form, for me this game's probably like a 4 out of 10. And then with the pixel remaster, it makes it like a 5.5 out of 10, something like that. I think, yeah, so the pixel remaster here does deserve some praise, although I will criticize the fact that the PC version doesn't have those boosters. So the Switch version, for example, has like the ability to turn off encounters and stuff, which for games like this I think is very essential. And you saw how it got me out of trouble and saved me a lot of frustration in certain bits where I would have ordinarily had to fight like another 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 encounters. And so it should have been patched in, or should have been made available from the start. Don't know why it isn't, but mods are pretty easy to find for it. So if you are playing on PC, playing on Steam, and you've been watching me play through and you're like, there's still too many encounters, I don't like this whole thing, you can definitely kind of play with less encounters than I did. Might make the game more challenging too, if you're deliberately just kind of skipping more encounters. But I would say it's for games like this, it really should be a must at this stage. If you're trying to bring it to a modern audience, I think allowing the ability to skip encounters, I mean, even obviously games like Final Fantasy X's HD remaster on Steam has the ability to skip encounters, and that was a much more modern game with way less egregious encounter rates than Final Fantasy 2, and they still did it. So for 2, I don't know why it wasn't patched. But yeah, I think that's generally what I would say. Yeah, not one of my favorites, but what this does mean is that we have made it through Final Fantasy 2, and there is only one game left to complete the set. I have been on this journey for so long, for so many years, and so many of you have been with me the whole way. And I'm really, really pleased to finally bring you guys Final Fantasy 1 relatively soon and complete the journey so that we have Final Fantasy 1 all the way through to 16 now on the channel. And that's going to be like a mission that's going to be so exciting for me to complete because, again, I started it so long ago that I just never knew if I'd make it to the end of it because the progress has been pretty slow. I have like a slow, methodical way of playing them and uploading them. And I knew it was going to take me years from the moment I started, and it's such an unpredictable business. No one knows where they're going to be in 3 years, in 5 years. The fact that I've been able to make it this far and keep growing and just keep going, and to be able to share finally the end of the journey with you guys, it's going to be a lot of fun. And I'm looking forward to seeing where it all began. So yeah, I'm going to leave with that. I'm looking forward to it. Stay tuned on the channel for when that's going to be. I'm not exactly sure. We're in a bit of a difficult time phase at the moment where potentially there's not enough time for me to start and complete Final Fantasy 1 before Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth comes out. And I don't want to get to the stage where I'm on like episode 36 and then Rebirth comes out and I'm trying to basically upload them both at the same time, or I have to take 3-4 months off and then complete the rest of Final Fantasy 1 later. So I'm going to see how it goes, but there's a chance I might wait until the summer when I'll be done basically with 7 Rebirth, and maybe around like June, July time, basically upload the final one in the series. And then we have like a nice clean slate where we've got 1 through to 16, including like 7 Remake, 7 Rebirth, all of that stuff. And then we decide where are we going to go from here. And that would be an interesting time for the channel once this mission, this extensive mission that's taken up basically most of my day-to-day uploading for years, will come to an end. So I look forward to seeing you guys there. Thank you for going on this journey with me, especially through Final Fantasy 2, because it was the least enjoyable one for me to play. And by extension, it's often the least enjoyable ones to watch. Like, the less of a good time I'm having, the less likely you guys are able to enjoy it too. So I apologize if it was a bit more of a boring, not as entertaining playthrough, but, you know, I always try to be honest with my experience. I share with you what I've gone through, and in this case, it wasn't the most positive experience. But hopefully with Final Fantasy 1, I've always heard that it's not a particularly amazing game, but people obviously give it a bit more of a pass because it is the daddy. It's where everything began, and obviously they had absolutely nothing to go on from before, and it's the birthplace of a franchise that changed all of our lives. So we have to give it a little bit of respect, even if we don't love the game all that much. So I'm looking forward to it. I will see you guys there. Thank you for watching. Take care.